Welcome to the StoryADay podcast. This is Julie Duffy, encouraging you to be a writer today, not someday. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It's Julie here from the StoryADay podcast. We are entering week 2 of StoryADay May, and lots of things are happening. I've been putting out prompts all week from writers, myself included, but also writers with an impressive pedigree, and there's more coming up this week, award winners and regular StoryADay participants. Lots and lots of good stuff coming your way. If you are in the Superstars group or the Challenge Plus version of the challenge, you'll know that I'm putting out pep talks every day. So it becomes a little bit difficult when I'm sitting down to think about the podcast, to think about what to say, but then I have to remember that not everyone who listens to the podcast is listening to me blather on every day at the beginning of the day to give them a writing prompt. So I am going to talk today about some of the things I talked about, the challenges of going into week 2, the point of continuing on with this challenge at this point, and some techniques for making it work for you. The first thing I wanted to talk about is, at this point, you may have signed up for StoryADay May thinking, that sounds like a bit of fun, and then realised that it's actually quite a lot of hard work, and you may be tempted to give up. There's a lot of people who get all excited, come to the website, and then don't show up again after about day 3, and I'm hoping that you're not one of those, because the point of StoryADay May, or any challenge like this, is it's good for your writing in a number of different ways. It's good for your practice to say, I'm going to find out if I can really sit down and write every day for a month. You'll probably find that you don't want to write every day forever. I think most people don't actually want to put new words on the page every day forever. There's so much else involved in writing, which I've talked about on this podcast before. But learning your limits is part of why we challenge ourselves with these challenges. So for your practice, for the practice of how often do I want to sit down to write? How fast can I write? What's my natural length that I sort of need to take a break after? Or what's my natural scene or story length? These kinds of things are things that you learn during a challenge like this. Of course, for your writing, it's great to do a challenge like this because it allows you to break through blocks by lowering your perfectionism, which we talked about last week. And there's also specific skills that you're learning. I talk about that in a few minutes when I talk about working with the prompts. The thing that's going to keep you going, it looks like the challenge and the community and the container that I've built here, it looks like these are the things that are going to help you keep going through the challenge. And if you're struggling and finding that those things are not enough, there's 2 things you can do. One is to lean in more to the community, comment on other people's comments, join the Challenge Plus, which you can still join, and get the little pep talks from me every day and see the comments from the Superstars, which is a very welcoming group. You can lean in like that. But if you're finding it hard to come back and stick with this challenge as we move into week 2, I suspect that what you might need to do is connect the practice of writing a story a day to a greater purpose. You think and know and feel that you're a writer. If you do this sort of deathbed exercise, right? When you're lying on your deathbed, what are you going to regret? Are you going to regret not having worked harder at your writing, not having really, really found a way to explore that part of yourself and to use that gift? So that's one way that you can connect to your purpose in being a writer, is to look forward into the future and think about how you want to be remembered and whether you're going to have any regrets. And that's fine. That's one way of doing it. But don't forget, it's not all just misery and regret. Remember that part of your purpose in building a writing practice is to be happier, is to make life easier for yourself. You know that when you're writing, life is easier. So if you're having trouble writing, if you're tempted to walk away from today's exercise or tomorrow's prompt, remind yourself why you're doing this. Not why you're writing a story today, but why you've taken this time to build a writing practice. It's about having happiness in your life now. It's about feeling fulfilled. It's about proving something to yourself. It's about setting a good example to people in your life who you may not know are watching you, or you may know are watching you, but you're kind of kidding yourself aren't watching you. It's about self-respect. It's about the fact that we are creative creatures as humans. This is part of our birthright, is to be creative. And it's also about taking control of one little part of your life. There's a lot in life that we can't control. I don't think any of us would have chosen this past year to be living through a pandemic, but there are things in our lives we can control, and you can control, to a certain extent, putting your creative work in a place of priority. I've talked to a lot of people over the last week who've said, this is a crazy week, because, you know, a lot of people who write end up in careers where they're teaching, and this time of year in the US and anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, I think, tends to be a pretty busy time for people like that. There's also people, you know, it's tax time. There's a lot of careers and, you know, parenting obligations, and people are busy. But the people I've talked to this week who are the happiest are the ones who've said, and you know what, in spite of the fact that I'm busy, in fact, because I was busy, I had to carve out time for this obligation that I've set myself to write a story a day. And it has been so helpful to have those times where, even though I'm busy, I'm doing something for me. So if you are busy and you're finding it hard to make time to write, please take the advice of the people who are doing it, the people who are crazy busy and who are still making time to write, because they are finding it's making everything else easier. So if you're having trouble writing, connect to your purpose. Remember why you're doing this. If you're busy, just find a way to make time, even if it's just to sketch out some ideas. Which leads me to the topic of this podcast, the second topic of this podcast, which is working with prompts. So a week into the StoryADay May challenge, it may look a little different from how you thought it was going to look. Even if you've done it before, every year, every challenge is different because you're different and your life is different. So if this past week has not gone how you thought it was going to go, whether that's better or worse, it's a good idea to take stock this weekend, or whenever you're listening to this podcast, and figure out what's been working for you and what hasn't. Now, some of the things that we've been talking about inside the community about working with prompts, I wanted to talk about today here to give you a sense of some of the ways that you might change the way you're thinking about working with prompts that might make them more fruitful for you or make it easier for you to write. So one of the things on the first day, that prompt that Fran Wilde gave us about the bridge, it was interesting to see how people worked with it. A lot of people used it literally. They put their characters on a bridge. Some wrote realistic fiction, and then some wrote fantasy. Some people used the bridge as an emotional or metaphorical bridge. And all of those things are completely valid ways of using that prompt. On today, Saturday the 8th, there is a very specific prompt. It's got a very specific scenario, which is not going to be the kind of writing that everybody does all the time. It lends itself to sort of fantasy or horror, but in talking to the group, I've found that people are using it in literal ways. They are incorporating it into told stories. You know, somebody in the story they're telling just refers to the scenario in the prompt, and it sparks a different story. Other people are using it as a sort of a story within a story or a game within a story. So there's lots of ways that you can take a prompt like this, which seems very specific and maybe not what you want to be writing about, and you can bend it and twist it to whatever you want to be writing about. Very important to understand that these prompts are here simply to spark an idea for you. If you want to run screaming from the prompt, hey, there's one thing you know you don't want to write about today, and that's fine. This is your challenge. You do whatever you want. One of the ones that I saw a lot of comments on was Roxane Gay's comment from prompt from Friday, where she wanted us to write a story which was a happy story in that it did not have a traumatic experience as the catalyst for the story. And that a lot of people that I meet, in short fiction in particular, but perhaps in all of their fiction, they write a lot of sad stuff or dark stuff or, not happy stories. And I think it's understandable because fiction is so emotional and we tend to remember the heightened emotions that come along with trauma. So when we're digging into our memories for story ideas, I think that and fiction can be a way of processing things, so it makes sense to me that a lot of stories are written that do have a kernel of trauma in them. And this is what Roxane Gay was trying to discourage us from doing, just as an exercise. And it brought up a lot of resistance for people. But what I want to say is, in the discussions I've had in the StoryADay community, one of the things that comes up again and again is that after the challenge is over, and maybe a year out from the challenge, people start talking about the fact that the prompts that they resisted the most often are the ones that spark the most interesting stories, and the ones that they come back to, and the ones that they learn the most from, and maybe even the ones that they work up and get published. So even if you resist a prompt, it's worth digging in and seeing what you can do. I think with the happy one as well, we also don't see an awful lot of great examples of this. People don't seem to value stories that don't have trauma at their heart. There's a great story in Diabolical Plots this week, written by one of the superstars, which is a really great publication, especially if you like speculative fiction. And Monique Cuillerrier wrote this story called The Pilgrims of Mars. And it's a story that I think really exemplifies this idea of a story that doesn't have trauma at its heart. It's a lovely story. I really, really enjoyed it. I mean, I'm a bit of a space nerd. I like stuff about Mars rovers anyway, but it was a really great example of a story that didn't have trauma at its heart. It wasn't necessarily what you might think of as a happy story, but I think it gets to the sense of that prompt. So if you go over to Diabolical Plots, I'll put the link in the text here, and you can see what I'm talking about. They don't tend to give Oscars to happy films. They don't tend to give awards to happy stories. We don't have an awful lot of really good examples of stories that people take seriously that aren't somber, or they don't have a serious issue at their heart. And humans aren't humans have humor, right? Humans deal with the darkest of situations sometimes with lightness. So don't be afraid that you're not going to get taken seriously just if you're writing a story that is happy, or that has something at the heart of it that isn't traumatic. And for those of you who are out there rolling your eyes at me and going, I don't do happy, that's fine. Try it, see what happens, and then move on. Because tomorrow's another day, and tomorrow will bring another prompt. So there are some thoughts for you for this week. I also want to encourage you to think about taking breaks Sometimes, for the people who are super busy in their jobs, writing a like story that they don't have time to angst over every day during May, that is a break from the stress that they are dealing with in their other areas of their life. For me, today I was writing did not look like me putting words on the page. It looked like me sitting at my desk knitting. And I don't always look at my knitting when I'm doing it. This time I just allowed myself to look at the needles, look at the yarn looping around it, look at the yarn pulling through the loops. Just that sort of repetitive motion allowed my brain to create. I had been sitting writing, kind of mind mapping out what I was going to write about, and I reached a point of diminishing returns with that. So that was when I picked up my knitting. If I hadn't, I was hosting a writing sprint for the StoryADay Superstars and Challenge Plus people, and so I had to be at my desk, right? Otherwise I might have got up and gone for a walk. But the point is, if you need to do something that doesn't look like putting words on the page, sometimes that can be the best thing you can do for your writing. For me, today it was knitting. For you, it might be walking. It might be taking a shower. As long as you come back to the writing and don't allow your break to go on too long, then it's absolutely fine to be writing in a way that doesn't necessarily look like writing to other people. It's also fine to take a day off. If you've decided that, this writing every day for a month lark is not for you, don't do it, right? Set new rules. Say, I'm going to take Sundays off, or I'm going to take Wednesdays off, or I'm going to write 4 stories a week. It's still an amazing pace to be writing at. So now that you've been at this for a week, take a moment to consider. I would maybe push on for another week and see how it goes and reconsider at the middle of the challenge. But if you know that you're unhappy with the process that you've put in place already, don't struggle on. You're allowed to change your rules. It's your challenge. Think about what you're trying to get out of this month, readjust, and keep moving forward. That's what I have for you this week. I wish you a wonderful week of writing. There are some amazing prompts coming up this week. You're going to love them. You might not love them, but I encourage you to write to them anyway, because like I say, sometimes the ones that you resist the most are the ones that you need to write. Keep writing, and I'll be back next week. Thanks for listening. Why not come over to the blog at storyaday.org and check out this week's writing prompts and articles. And in the meantime, have a great creative week, and of course, keep writing.